Good evening, folks. Russ James Ramsland Jr. is an international business entrepreneur whose ventures have taken him all over the world for projects involving oil and gas exploration, advanced communications, finance, and commercial real estate. He has previously worked on Capitol Hill for Texas congressman and also worked with the Reagan administration, NASA, and MIT to develop new semiconductor materials for the Space Shuttle and Strategic Defense Initiative. Mr. Ramsland is a founder of the Parks Cities Preston Hollow Leadership Forum, raising awareness and fostering the political involvement of its members at all levels of government. He's also a former U.S. congressional candidate and serves on 3 corporate boards. He's received numerous professional and political awards. Professionally, he is the founding member and chief financial officer for Allied Special Operations Group in Dallas, Texas, a company that is best described as the world's only true private intelligence agency serving both private and government concerns, with worldwide capabilities that very few private or government entities can match. He's a graduate of Duke University with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in political science and holds an MBA from Harvard Business School. Please welcome Russ Ramsland.
Well, I know that all of you are struggling to overcome your disappointment at not hearing Commissioner Fakes sing the Star Spangled Banner, but bear with me and we'll try to make it up to you here a little bit. Connecting the dots is it's the first of 4 talks. I'll tell you a little bit about how all this got started. I was asked to speak to a group of high schoolers who were going through a week-long program in Dallas. And they were going to hear from Dallas Cowboy and from the mayor and various government officials there in the city and business leaders. And one of these gals came up with a bright idea that, well, let's have somebody talk to them about politics. Really? So she came to me and I said, well, why do you hate me this much? I mean, this is, but she said, no, this, you'll be okay. So I said, all right, fine. So I approached it a little differently. And to my surprise, at the end of the week, I got voted the best speaker out of the 18 speakers. So they invited me back. So we tried it again the next year, et cetera, et cetera. Well, pretty soon, some parents started showing up going, what were you telling my kid? This is interesting. He's talking in a way I hadn't heard before. So then they started having me go to Sunday schools, and then they started having me go to service organizations. But I have kept the basic talk so that you can understand a little bit about how I approached it with these kids and why, because it really is tragic that so many of them in their schooling, and even in some cases in their churches, don't really hear about their country, and they cannot connect the dots, so to speak. Now, out of this came also the second talk called The Deep State, where I explore the historical origins and roots of the deep state. It goes back, I'll give you a hint, to Nazi Germany. That's where it all really came together. And then that leads to the third talk I give, which is the Cultural Revolution or Culture Wars. And then the last one is Capitalism, the daily workout routine for the Judeo-Christian nation. So there's a whole series of them, but this is the first one, and let's jump right in here. Now, I start out with these kids. I won't drag you guys through all this, but when I start out with the kids, you have to realize these are all kids who are juniors and seniors. They are under incredible pressure to figure out what they're going to do the day they graduate. Will they get into college or trade school or university? Will it be the one they want? Once they start down that road, they are sort of this mindset that they're going to have to do that forever. And so this is a one-time decision. They're under all this pressure, and I just start out with this resume, and I said, let me tell you something. There's not a thing on this resume that's planned. So you can forget your plan. It's not going to work out that way. But the good news is that you live in the only country in the world where that's true. You know, if you go to France, they pay your college. Free college, just what AOC is talking about, free college. What they don't tell you, though, is that you don't get to change. If you decide you're going to be an accountant in France and they put you through university and you get your equivalent to being an accountant, when you decide you don't want to do that anymore, you're retired. And you're retired with whatever you have put away for your stipend then. And so if you decide at 44 you don't want to be an accountant anymore, you haven't really put away a lot, you don't get a lot, that's the way the system works. You cannot work in France and do something different. You have to move out of the country. Kids are going, whoa, nobody ever told us that before. Anyway, so when we go through this, and I lead them through it, and I explain to them what a catastrophic resume this is, and why HR people go screaming into the night if they ever saw a guy like me running around loose, I say, okay, so how does this happen? How does it happen that this country can let people like me run around relatively unsupervised and even be successful? How can that be? So they're interested. And I said, now the place we're going to start is that there was a recent Harvard poll of 18 to 29-year-olds, and there were 10,000 of them in this poll. And what was really interesting is that the first question was, here's 20 nouns, and you're to pick your top three. 78% of them picked the same top three as their priorities. And those were freedom, prosperity, and certainty. Yeah. I said, well, that's not bad. The problem is the second question. The second question said, well, now, of those of you who picked freedom, prosperity, and certainty, what's the form of government you think will best deliver that for you? Half of them picked socialism. And of those who picked socialism came the third question. Tell us about your religious beliefs or life, if any. Half of those who answered socialism said they were weekly church-going Christians. Really? Now, everybody in this room realizes that this is the closest thing to insanity you can think of, but these kids actually, this is the way they think. And so what this talk was all about was to go back and connect the dots so that at the end of this came from a Harvard Institute of Politics poll, so that at the end of the day, they could understand why this makes no sense to give those answers. It's totally incoherent. To talk about it, though, you first have to talk about, well, what is prosperity? Kids don't know what prosperity is. You go to these kids and you say, well, you know, what's prosperity? They think it's just a lot of money. And I went, no, I'm sorry, you guys are completely on the wrong track. You see, prosperity is time saved. So the question here is, it's not money, it is time saved. And who invented it, and how did it evolve, and what's needed to sustain it. Kids are stunned to find out that somebody had to invent prosperity. But we're going to talk about that tonight. Now, it all starts, actually, let me back up just a second. I also make the point to them that because they have one of these, they are more prosperous than Louis XVI. Because they can do more on this in 5 minutes than Louis could do with tens of thousands of courtiers, etc., in 2 years. That's time saved. And that's what prosperity really is. So, we'll put that evil device down. Let's talk about it. Now, we're going to go back about 180,000 years of man hanging around. The good news is, in understanding prosperity, we can write off the first 100,000 years because nothing happened. There was no prosperity. there was only one tool in the toolbox, and this was a hand axe. And the hand axe was interesting for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons it's interesting is that it's about the same size and the same shape and weighs about the same as a computer mouse. And interestingly enough, the story going from left to right is the story of prosperity. And at this point, these kids are going, boy, they really shouldn't have let this guy in. But the thing that's interesting about the hand axe is that anybody could make one. In fact, everybody had to be able to make one because that was the only tool in the toolbox. And you killed animals with it, you skinned them with it, you had to use it to shave wood to make the fire, all that kind of stuff. Whereas nobody can make a computer mouse. It takes millions of people cooperating with each other to make a computer mouse. You have to have an oil and gas industry. You have to have a pipeline industry. You have to have geologists. You have seismologists, drilling people. You have to have refineries. You have to have just this. And that's just for the case. We haven't even gotten to the electronics yet. So it takes millions of people to create a computer mouse, but anyone could have made a hand axe. In other words, the hand axe is pure, total self-sufficiency, whereas, the computer mouse is the ultimate in specialization. So, how does all this come about? Well, back about 80,000 years ago, there was this guy, caveman, and we're going to call him Grog. And Grog is like every other caveman. He's got his hand axe. He's going out there. He gets up early. He goes out in the fields. He just has to find the exact right moment when he can be in a tree and leap down on an animal and clunk it before it chomps his fingers off because he just got this little hand axe and stuff like that. And it takes all day long. He gets back. He's dirty. He's bloody, but he's got something for the family to eat, etc., etc. Life was not good. So what happens is that one day Grog gets this great idea, and he decides that he is going to take some wet rawhide and he's going to take a stick and he's going to lay it alongside this hand axe and he's going to wrap this wet rawhide around it and then hold it to the fire until all the water finally comes out of the rawhide. It shrinks down and gets really hard and it attaches the handle to the hand axe. Now the good news about that is that it makes his fingers be at least 1.5 feet further away from the fangs and the teeth of the animal that he's trying to subdue. So the odds that he's going to end up not being called nine-finger Grog is a lot better. So he starts doing this primitive tools deal. And the first thing that happens is it's very interesting because he comes home now at about 2 p.m. And he's not so dirty and tired as all the other guys who are coming in and they're still having to subdue animals with just a hand axe. And, Grog's kind of at the cave. He's got his feet up on the rock. He's enjoying life there. And his cousin, Thud, walks in. And Thud can't figure out how Grog does this. And Grog says, well, it's this cool new thing I call a hatchet. And Thud said, Thud won't hatchet. So Grog said, yeah, but I'm pretty busy, Grog, Thud's looking at him going, don't look too busy to me. But he says, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. You and I are going to cooperate. If you go out, Thud, tomorrow and kill enough food for my family too, first, I'll loan you my hatchet so you can do it. And secondly, I'll sit home and I'll make a hatchet for you. And that's what happened. And now both Thud and Grog are kind of hanging around at 2 p.m, wishing there was the ball game on the rock, but there's not. And everybody starts to notice this, and they all want one. Well, pretty soon the guys down the river start to hear about this, and they all want one. And so what happens in Grog's village is they organize themselves. And Grog is constantly playing with how to better attach the stick to the hand axe, and he's getting better and better at it, and he's learned more and more about exactly what kind of sticks work better than the other ones. And now he's got a team of guys going out there and getting sticks that are the exact right kind. He's got a team of guys out there making hand axe, the rock heads, and he's sitting there assembling them. And they're trading them with the guys down the river, and nobody in Grog's village goes out and hunts anymore because they're trading them. And they're trading them for meat and skins and all those other things that those sweaty guys down the river are having to go get. Now, this may not sound like a big deal to you, but this was the first trade. Now, human beings are the only creatures that trade. Have you ever thought about that? Your dog Fido will never take his purple plush dragon toy next door and trade it to Fido for his bone. They don't do that. But we do. And the interesting thing about that is that may be sort of a little bit about what the Bible talks about when he talks about the fact that God gave man dominion. Well, the notion and instinct to trade is what goes a long way to give us dominion. So anyway, they do all this stuff, and the first thing you find out is some very interesting things start happening. Not only do you have trade, but as we said, you have specialization. You start figuring out how to make a hand axe and a hatchet better, and you innovate. And we begin to see historically that these hand axes, and we know they all came from here because these are the only place you can quarry the kind of rocks that they found in these hatchets that got all the way over here. And at the same time, you begin to see shell beads that only originated in these waters coming this way. And they began to realize, holy smokes, trade is no longer now just the village, it's beginning to get worldwide. And this is like 25,000 BC. So, very interesting. And then it finally gets to where enough people are prosperous and they have enough time that they begin to figure out how to make candles and paint and all that kind of stuff. And we see that because right here at 16,000 BC, you have the caves at Lascaux, which are in the Dordogne region of France. And if you ever get a chance, you ought to go. It's amazing. These primitive pictures that are just incredible to think about how much time and effort they had to have as spare time to do them. It's called the Sistine Chapel of the Caveman World. So that was all due to increasing trade, innovation, and specialization, and that has the effect of increasing prosperity. So if you look at this on a timeline, caves of Lascaux are over here at about 16,000, and somewhere around 93 or 9400 BC, we have farming. There have been enough tools, and people are beginning to learn enough now that they've got hoes and all this kind of stuff, and they begin to farm. Well, once you have farming, people can begin to quit migrating. They don't have to follow the food all the time. And so we begin to see the very first little villages and things like that. Things go along until about 3300. We found Yeatsy, the Iceman, in the 90s. He was a 3300 BC caveman. And he was startling to them because when they found Yeatsy's mummified remains up in the Italian and Swiss Alps, they got a look at him and they realized, holy smokes, this guy has more tools on him than people who found him. And not only that, but he had all these kinds of plants for medicines. He was wearing the skins from 27 different kinds of animals that he was using for the boots or the loincloth. And some of these animals were known to not exist within 500 or 600 miles of where they found him. So the trading had to be massive actually going on. So it's not too surprising that about that same time, we saw the start of the Egyptian Empire. Now, with the rise of the empires, we now get to the relationship between prosperity and freedom. Because remember, those kids said they valued freedom and prosperity, but they hadn't connected the dots, that there was a very real connection there. So now we're going to jump into that. And we can start jumping into that by looking at a few of the empires. We had the Egyptian, the Assyrian, the Persian, the Babylonian, the Israeli, the Greek. If we have more time, I'd expound on a few of those. The Phoenician I will spend a moment on, but the point I'm going to make to you in just a minute is that every one of these empires had a cycle where they rose and then they declined. And I'm going to tell you about that cycle. The only one that was kind of interesting in this case, though, was Phoenicia. Phoenicia, as you may or may not know, was not an empire in the traditional sense. It was a collection of city-states. And I mean, these guys were just wild inventors, and they were terrific traders, and they had the cedars of Lebanon. And so they were the first guys to figure out how to make boats big enough and strong enough to get out of rivers and sail across the Mediterranean. And when they started doing that, they became like the FedEx of the Mediterranean. And no, seriously. And so what was interesting is then they had to learn how to navigate better once they were trying to sail across the Mediterranean. They started inventing all kinds of new stuff having to do with sail technology and keels and all this kind of stuff. And eventually they were so successful at trading, they had to invent something called double entry bookkeeping. So the Phoenicians were an amazing inventive group, but they were never an empire in the classic sense. And so they were very easy to pick off, and that's what happened. You saw first Alexander the Great went around and started picking off the city-states around the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and then you had the Romans finish off the remains. Now, I said we would talk a little bit about, maybe not. The cycles of rise and decline that we saw in all these empires. All of them started with trade, just like Grog when he first traded with Thud. And that led to innovation because there was a certain amount of increase in specialization. That went up, and with specialization and innovation going up, prosperity we see goes up, and then we see the standard of living go up, and then that's all happening in a very free environment. Grog did not have to file an environmental impact log with the local leader. It was really a good thing. But when you start having empires and cities, that leads to urbanization. Now guys are all living together. You got agriculture going on. You then have to have somebody to govern this mess. And so you have a governing class come up. And then a bureaucracy shows up right after that, and then you have regulations in government because the bureaucracy has to have something to justify its existence. And then with that, you get all kinds of other things that come along, like taxation to pay for the bureaucrats and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of times then you have to resort to protectionism from the next camp down, so that you're not, because you're having to pay taxes and they're not, your goods have to be more expensive, so then protectionism does it. And pretty soon, before you know it, you've lost a lot of freedom. Now you're being governed. And with that, you begin to see that trade has a tendency to go down. And you'll see that that means that innovation and specialization go down because you've got a lot of extra regulation. And then you see that suddenly you have to become more self-sufficient because all that other good stuff that came about with specialization, trade, and innovation is drying up. And when you have to go back to more self-sufficiency, prosperity goes down, standard of living goes down, and in fact, you finally arrive at Matt Ridley's famous quote, "Each empire was a product of trading wealth and was itself the eventual cause of that wealth's destruction. Merchant and craftsmen make prosperity, chiefs, priests, and thieves fritter it away." Never been a truer statement. So, the real critical question for these kids is there anything about this different about America, or are we doomed to this same cycle? And the answer really lies in the relationship between freedom and prosperity. But before we go there, I have to give them a little background about socialism, because a lot of these kids really don't know what socialism is. So we talk about it and we say, look, so you understand socialism is essentially a view that man can remake man and have him be better off. That man can change the nature of mankind and make man be better off. It's utopia. The equality, they think, they say the problem with most of man is that it's jealousy, it's the desire to want to be better than the neighbor, it's all that kind of stuff. And so we're just going to make everybody be equal. So now there won't be any jealousy. We'll just wipe that off. We'll take that out of the human psyche. And it's marketed as equality, but it really requires the removal of freedom in order to eliminate the differences. And but when you remove freedom, as we've just seen, you also end up reducing innovation, trade, specialization, and therefore prosperity. I like the idea that mice die in mousetraps because they do not understand why the cheese appears to be free. So we do this and we say, look, why does socialism always fail? Because all these kids are thinking this sounds like such a good idea. And I think it's really important to give them just a real simple idea about that. This could be a graph of any different attribute you want. This could be 10 people, and this could be the difference in their height, their singing ability, for instance, the commissioner and I, our weight, our gender, our athletic ability, our artistic ability. Your 3-year-old is better than I am in that regard. Musical talents, dexterity, attitude, all this kind of stuff. All of us are so different, okay? But in a society, together, that's the whole of the prosperity generating capability of the society. Now what happens, the reason that socialism fails is because, notice, this guy is the least common denominator. Let's go back. See? He's the least common denominator. So what has to happen is, if you're going to do socialism, you gotta take away enough freedom to push everybody down to that. And so what you lose is all this potential of man that before you had harnessed and working together. And that's why socialism ultimately never works. It's really simple. So it's sold on the idea that it's sympathy, but it's not. It's about tyranny, because that's what it takes. So now let's go back to those empires we talked about. And this is what you might call the org chart of history. There may or may not have been a god at the top of all of these empires and cultures and societies. Most of them were trivial. They were very horrible people that explained things. These guys really were the ones that ran everything, the oligarchs, the kings. In the early time, it was the head of the Catholic Church, etc., etc. This was government. And then everybody else was down here. They were what were called subjects. Now, there's a reason why they were called subjects. This was news to your kids. They were called subjects because they were subject to the will of the oligarch. That's literally why their name came up. And all civilizations worked this way. This was their org chart. And everybody was real happy about it until one day this guy shows up. And his name was Jesus Christ. And he just really screwed things up. He was the most polarizing political figure in the history of creation. Now I said political figure. Up until that time, this was all about man, i.e. these guys, defining what order was and then using force that removed freedom in order to enforce it. But when this guy shows up and upsets the apple cart, something new happens. He now says, you know what? You have a personal relationship with God. Order, truth, and virtue are defined by God. And you know what? It's individual responsibility and the love of this man who creates the desire in your heart to try to be a better person. And it allows great freedom when we all self-police ourselves. Great freedom. So you get a new org chart. These guys get promoted from being subjects to citizens. And these guys end up being down here where they're not really very happy being. These guys are sort of the board of directors. It's the merchants, it's the craftsmen that we just were talking about. And they rely on each individual governing himself according to an agreed moral code that's based on love. Another way to think about it, if you were more of a political science type, would be to say that this is really sort of about macro morality. personal conduct really isn't important. In those societies, only a blind commitment to do what the leader says is what's important. It's what you get with what's called identity politics, a term we now are all familiar with and nobody heard of 30 years ago. But with this, it's all about micro-morality. It's the idea that we transform the world by focusing on our own personal morality and our own personal transformation through it. Okay. Let's see. This is a noted theologian, Napoleon Bonaparte. Let's just take a quick look. You may not have read the Gospel according to Napoleon, but you're going to be surprised at the observations the man made. He said that Alexander, Caesar, and Charlemagne and myself founded empires, but what was the foundation? Force. He says, Jesus Christ founded his upon love, and at this hour millions of men would die for him. Everything in him astonishes me. His spirit overawes me, his will confounds me. He is a being by himself. His ideals, his sentiments, the truth which he announces, his manner of convincing are not explained either by human organization or the nature of things. And he goes on and on. We won't go through all of this, but he does say that Jesus borrowed nothing from our sciences. One can find absolutely nowhere but in him alone the imitation or the example of his life, and that he basically compels men through love to try to be better men and do and be what God really intended him to be, even though we will never achieve it. Okay, now, that's where we were, and you see, that's the problem today. What we're facing today is that these guys want to get back up here, and they want these guys to get back down here. That's what the whole argument is about. In fact, when I go in and do my talk on culture wars, we spend a lot of time on that. And in a lot of cases today, they just said, hey, we're not even going to pretend we need a God. So that's sort of, it's back to the old force thing. Venezuela is a perfect example. You know, they used to be the 40th highest per capita. 40 years ago, they were 4th highest per capita in the world. Today, there are no dogs there. They've had to eat them. Argentina, we're seeing it unfold in Hong Kong. And when I talk to the kids, I talk to them about Panem. Everybody here kind of gets this weird look on Panem. This is the country of the Hunger Games. And all of your kids have read it. It is a dystopian novel. It is the 1984 of their time. And when you suddenly identify this with Panem, scales fall from their eyes. Controls and limits freedom, unleashes freedom, and that one extinguishes freedom. All right, we're going to do one more thing with this. Since this and this are essentially the same sort of thing, let's just put them next door to each other. So you see, this is where the guys want to go, and whole deal. And basically, this is, I don't know if any of you ever saw Hamilton, but there's a great line in there where King George says, if push comes to shove, I will send an armed battalion to remind you of my love. And that's really their attitude. They really kind of, pretend like they care about you. But American exceptionalism is all about people who are willing to try to govern themselves according to an agreed moral code. And in our case, that's the Judeo-Christian heritage of the country. Let's see. We won't spend a lot of time on that because I know we're short of time today. So, what does free enterprise or capitalism, using Karl Marx's term, what does it really mean? Well, basically, the point I wanted to make to all these kids is capitalism actually requires altruistic conduct, because the only way you improve your life is by better serving your fellow man. It's the only system in the world economically that works that way. Socialism, there really is no such thing as the customer. There is no customer because there is no choice. And we go through all this and we talk about that a lot with them. Eventually, and this just kind of goes through what we've gone and talked about already. But I needed to get them finally to the last point because, we've talked about freedom and prosperity, but we've still not worked in certainty. So now we've got to introduce the word virtue so that we can start talking about certainty. And in doing that, we have to talk about republics and democracies and the Constitution and why it really only works in a Judeo-Christian based nation. A lot of people, particularly your children, don't know that a republic is all about the individual. It's about the individual's rights. Whereas a democracy is about the mass. It's about the majority. It's about three wolves and a sheep having a discussion about what's for lunch. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Go with that. A lot of these kids are under the notion that this is really what the political arena looks like. You have the far right out here that are called fascists. You have the far left out here that are Marxists, the socialists, communists. And then we have this area in the middle of supposed moderates. This is garbage. This is absolute garbage. Because these guys, as we saw in the org chart, and these guys really believe the exact same thing, they just don't agree with who should be the guy running the show. So let's redraw this a little bit in order to understand some stuff. We're going to take this arrow and we're going to pull it down here, and this arrow and pull it down here so that all these guys and these guys are all in the same camp. And it'll look kind of like that. Down here are the oligarchies, and here is a republic. And this system sees you as an individual, like we said. This system looks at you as identity groups. And they like you as identity groups because then you have to give away rights to some and not the others. In our system, we have this thing called a Constitution, and it is a wall, just like, think of it as a real live wall that basically on this side of the wall, there are free people who will not experience equal outcomes. On this side of the wall, we will have equal people who will not experience any freedom. And this one can run with the rule of law because people are voluntarily complying with an agreed moral base. And this one basically says truth is relative, virtue is blind obedience to the state, and here's what is virtue today. And that's getting us kind of down towards the end of things. And that is to understand what Reagan's Shining City on a Hill was all about, because this really kind of sums it all up. And this is where your kids suddenly get really, really interested. If you want to go up to the Shining City on the Hill, which is going to be up here, you have to start with the first step, and that's really the Ten Commandments. After the Ten Commandments, since you kind of agree what's right and wrong, and it's not going to change every week, depending on who's king, you can have a common moral base. If you have a common moral base about what's right and wrong, then you can have a rule of law that supposedly reflects it. You know, it's one thing that we all kind of agree you should stop at a red light. But what if we lived in a world that said, no, red light, you just go if you want to go? Well, pretty soon you have a pile up at every single intersection. You have to have a policeman out there with a gun using force to stop certain people and let other people through. When you have, though, the rule of law, and it reflects the common moral base, that was the problem in the Obama years. Law no longer began to reflect the common moral base that most of us have. But when you do, when these two reflect each other, then you have great stability. And what is another name for stability? Certainty. That's exactly right. And when you have certainty, and you know what's going to go on, and you have freedom, you have liberty and freedom, then you also have prosperity. And so all three of those things they picked out were deeply interconnected with each other, but they didn't know how, and they didn't know why, and they drew the wrong conclusions. And the really great thing about prosperity is that with prosperity, you get to the very top of the shining city on the hill, which is benevolence. We're the most benevolent nation in the whole world. In fact, in 2014, 54% of all charitable giving worldwide came from us, who represent only 4% of the populace. We are benevolent beyond belief compared to the rest of the world. So, this is the last thought. What would you like to pass along? Well, the first one is, if you hope for prosperity, freedom, and certainty, your kids better hope this country doesn't forget its Judeo-Christian roots. They may not want to be a Christian, that's fine, but they better hope this country stays that way if these are the values they have, because they are all tied into each other. It's fine to talk about, in fact, in culture wars we talk about the Enlightenment, and there's a lot of churches that give credit to this country as being based on the Enlightenment. Wrong. The Enlightenment gave you the French Revolution. Christianity gave you ours. Big difference. There is a right and a wrong, and that's not going to change. Truth is noble. It is objective. Think about ourselves as individuals with freedom. We have equal rights, but not equal outcomes. That's what that rule of law is about. And realize that we are really lucky to be, realize that we are really lucky to be alive right now, because, in a weird way, we are participating in the Second American Revolution. This is probably the most difficult time this country has really faced, looking back, since the American Revolution. And if you go down and you touch that seat you're sitting on right now, just touch your seat cushion a minute. Okay? That's the seat that George Washington sat in, Thomas Jefferson sat in, James Madison, Hamilton. They just stood up. And that's what we have to do. And you'd be amazed at the end of this discussion, your kids are sitting there going, wow, that's just not what we've heard before. So I'm going to leave you with this. Liberty unleashes the human capacity to innovate. It unleashes human creativity. The poverty that plagues our country cannot be solved by a dictator. It cannot be solved by the state. The only way to get rid of this scourge is without the interference of the state. Anybody know who that is? I really wouldn't expect it. It was the Venezuelan opposition leader, Jan Goicoechea. He was arrested and imprisoned Monday, September 5th, 2016 in Caracas, and has not been heard from since. Now, because this was a talk for your kids, my final slide is simply this one. In America, the future is yours because of freedom. Don't waste it. Don't take it for granted. Jim here, he has a bachelor's degree in philosophy. He has $100,000 in student debt. He can't find a job as a philosopher, which is what he majored in. And he believes people without college degrees are stupid. Over here we have Joe. Joe has a 4-year paid apprenticeship. So he has 0 student debt. He earns $80,000 a year, and he just disconnected Jim's electricity.
Oh, good. This is hysterical.